You're standing on a windswept fjord, watching Viking longships return from their raids, when you witness something that makes your stomach turn. A young woman, barely 16, is dragged from the ship in chains while the crowd cheers. What you're about to discover about female slavery in Viking society will shatter every romanticized image you've ever held about these legendary warriors. The Vikings gave us epic sagas, masterful seafaring, and a warrior culture that still captivates us today. But beneath the gleaming axes and dragon-headed ships lay a system of female bondage so brutal that modern historians struggle to document it without confronting humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty. These weren't isolated incidents or cultural misunderstandings. They were institutional practices that turned human beings into living commodities, where a woman's existence was measured solely by her usefulness for labor, breeding, and sexual exploitation. The evidence comes from archaeological discoveries, legal codes, and saga literature that reveals how an entire civilization built its expansion on the systematic enslavement of women. What we'll explore weren't aberrations in Viking culture. They were the foundation upon which Norse society operated for over 3 centuries. Before we continue, if you're interested in the hidden truths of medieval history, consider subscribing and let me know in the comments what other dark historical topics you'd like me to explore. It's fascinating that we can uncover these forgotten stories together from around the world, connected by our need to understand the past, no matter how disturbing it becomes. The most psychologically devastating aspect of female slavery in Viking society began before these women could even comprehend their fate. Young girls were captured specifically during raids, often before they reached their 10th birthday. The case of thralls taken from Irish monasteries provides a horrifying window into this systematic acquisition process that would make modern trafficking operations seem primitive by comparison. Viking raiders didn't simply pillage for gold and silver. They hunted human cargo with the same methodical precision they used to navigate treacherous seas. Women and children represented the most valuable prizes because they could be trained, bred, and exploited for decades. The younger the captive, the higher the price they commanded in slave markets across Scandinavia. The selection process was terrifyingly systematic. Raiders evaluated female captives like livestock, checking for physical defects, estimating reproductive potential, and assessing their suitability for different types of bondage. Those deemed most attractive faced immediate sexual exploitation, while others were sorted for domestic labor or breeding programs that treated human reproduction as agricultural planning. The transportation of these captives reveals the calculated nature of this exploitation. Viking ships were modified with special compartments below deck, where enslaved women were chained during voyages that could last weeks. The conditions were designed for maximum efficiency rather than human survival. Women were packed into spaces barely large enough to lie down, with minimal food and water, while waste accumulated around them. Many captives died during these voyages, but Vikings had calculated these losses into their profit margins. The survivors arrived at their destinations already broken by the journey, making them easier to control and less likely to attempt escape. This systematic brutalization wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate strategy to destroy the spirits of enslaved women before they even reached their final owners. The slave markets themselves operated with commercial efficiency that would impress modern business analysts. Major trading centers like Hedeby and Birka featured dedicated areas where human beings were displayed, examined, and sold like any other commodity. These markets weren't hidden or shameful activities. They were central features of Viking economic life that operated openly with the full support of local authorities. The pricing structure for female slaves reveals the calculated dehumanization at the heart of Norse society. Young women commanded the highest prices, with their value decreasing based on age, physical condition, and perceived usefulness. Pregnant women were considered damaged goods, because pregnancy interfered with their immediate availability for labor and sexual service. The most valuable slaves were those who could serve multiple functions within a household. A woman who could weave, cook, tend animals, and satisfy her master sexually commanded premium prices. This economic logic created a nightmare of versatility where women had to master domestic skills alongside enduring sexual exploitation, knowing that inadequacy in any area could result in sale to worse conditions. The legal framework surrounding female slavery in Viking society created a system where abuse wasn't just permitted but legally protected. The law codes of medieval Scandinavia explicitly defined enslaved women as property with the same legal status as livestock or tools. They could be bought, sold, traded, beaten, or killed at their owner's discretion without any legal consequences. Female thralls existed in a state of complete legal death. They could not own property, make contracts, give testimony in legal proceedings, or make any decisions about their bodies or their time. Even their children belonged entirely to their owners, who could sell them, kill them, or raise them for specific purposes within the household. The sexual exploitation of female slaves was not only accepted, but institutionalized within Viking culture. Masters were expected to use their female thralls for sexual gratification, and this exploitation was viewed as a natural right of ownership rather than abuse. The concept of consent was meaningless in a legal system that didn't recognize slaves as capable of giving or withholding permission for anything. This systematic sexual abuse extended beyond individual households into organized networks that treated human sexuality as a commercial enterprise. Some wealthy Vikings operated what can only be described as breeding farms, where female slaves were forced to reproduce with male slaves chosen for desirable characteristics. The children born from these unions became property to be sold or used as their owners saw fit. The psychological techniques used to break the spirits of enslaved women were as sophisticated as any modern brainwashing program. New slaves underwent systematic processes designed to destroy their sense of individual identity and replace it with complete submission to their master's will. They were given new names, forbidden to speak their native languages, and punished for any behavior that suggested independent thought or resistance. The methods used to maintain this psychological control reveal the calculated cruelty underlying Viking society. Female slaves who showed any signs of defiance faced punishments designed not just to inflict pain, but to serve as warnings to other enslaved women. Public beatings were common, with slaves forced to witness the torture of their companions as reminders of their own vulnerability. The isolation techniques were particularly devastating for these women. Rebellious slaves were separated from others and kept in underground storage pits for weeks, deprived of human contact except when being dragged out for punishment or sexual service. This social deprivation broke many women more effectively than physical violence, turning them into hollow shells of their former selves. Masters employed sophisticated reward and punishment systems that created artificial hierarchies among enslaved women. Those who demonstrated complete obedience might receive slightly better food or warmer clothing, creating incentives for slaves to police each other's behavior and report signs of defiance. This system turned victims against each other, preventing the formation of bonds that might lead to collective resistance. The breeding programs operated by wealthy Viking households reveal the complete dehumanization of enslaved women. Female thralls were evaluated like prize cattle, with their reproductive history, physical characteristics, and perceived genetic traits recorded in detail. Masters selected breeding partners based on desired outcomes, forcing women to mate with men chosen solely for their potential to produce valuable offspring. Pregnancy offered no respite from exploitation. Pregnant slaves were expected to continue their regular duties until the moment of birth, often delivering children while chained to prevent escape attempts. The survival rate for both mothers and infants was catastrophically low. But Vikings had calculated these losses as acceptable costs of their breeding operations. children born to slave mothers faced immediate separation from their parents. Viking law granted masters complete ownership over slave offspring, who could be sold, killed, or assigned specific roles within the household based on their perceived usefulness. Slave mothers who showed excessive attachment to their children faced brutal punishment designed to sever these natural bonds. The systematic disposal of unwanted slave children reveals the moral bankruptcy of this system. Infant slaves were regularly killed through exposure, drowning, or outright murder when their owners deemed them economically unviable. Female children were particularly vulnerable because they were considered less valuable than males for heavy labor, though they might be preserved if they showed potential for future sexual exploitation. The religious dimension of slavery added spiritual torture to physical and psychological abuse. Female thralls were forced to participate in Norse religious ceremonies that celebrated the very system enslaving them. They had to serve at feasts, honoring gods who allegedly sanctioned their bondage, prepare ritual offerings using their stolen labor, and maintain household shrines dedicated to deities who offered them no protection. The most devastating aspect of this religious participation was how it corrupted any relationship slaves might have with sources of spiritual comfort. They could not appeal to their own gods because practicing foreign religions was forbidden under penalty of death. They could not find solace in Norse deities because those same gods were portrayed as supporters of the slavery system. This spiritual isolation compounded their physical bondage, leaving them without hope of divine intervention or afterlife justice. The economic network supporting female slavery extended throughout the known world, creating international trade routes in human misery that connected Scandinavia with Byzantium, the Islamic world, and Western Europe. Ships regularly transported cargoes of enslaved women between trading centers, with specialized dealers maintaining inventories of human beings like merchants stocked amber or furs. The profits from this trade funded many of the military campaigns and cultural achievements we associate with Viking civilization. The great halls, the elaborate ship burials, the intricate metalwork that defined Norse culture were all built with wealth extracted from enslaved labor, including the systematic exploitation of countless women whose names have been lost to history. The documentation of these practices exists in disturbing detail because Vikings were meticulous record keepers who saw nothing shameful in their actions. Saga literature casually references the rape and abuse of slave women as routine aspects of household management. Legal codes specify the proper methods for punishing enslaved females. Archaeological evidence reveals the remains of women buried with clear signs of violent deaths and physical abuse. Perhaps most chilling is how thoroughly this system had corrupted the moral sensibilities of Norse society. Free women, despite their own limited rights, often participated in the abuse of enslaved women, seeing their elevated status as dependent on maintaining the system that brutalized others. The wives of wealthy Vikings supervised the sexual exploitation of female thralls, treating the rape of enslaved women as a household management responsibility. The normalization of sexual violence against enslaved women created a culture where rape was viewed as property use rather than human violation. Masters who sexually assaulted their female slaves faced no social condemnation because they were simply utilizing their own possessions. The concept of consent became meaningless in a society that refused to recognize slaves as human beings capable of making decisions about their own bodies. This systematic dehumanization extended to every aspect of daily existence for enslaved women. They couldn't choose their clothing, decide when to eat or sleep, select their work assignments, or make any choices about their bodies or their time. They existed in a state of complete subjugation that reduced human beings to animated tools that happened to be made of flesh rather than iron or wood. The scale and brutality of female slavery in Viking society challenges our romanticized assumptions about Norse civilization. The archaeological evidence sits in museums across Scandinavia, The legal codes survive in medieval manuscripts, and the saga literature openly celebrates practices that any modern observer would recognize as crimes against humanity. The systematic brutalization of women in Viking society reveals how entire civilizations can construct elaborate justifications for the most heinous crimes against humanity. These women's stolen lives built the longships we admire today. Their suffering financed the epic hauls and warrior culture that still captures our imagination. The evidence remains preserved in Scandinavian archives, documented by a society that saw nothing wrong with reducing human beings to commercial transactions. Understanding this history isn't about condemning modern Scandinavia or dismissing Viking achievements. It's about recognizing how easily populations become complicit in systematic dehumanization when it serves economic and cultural interests. The voices of these enslaved women have been largely silenced by centuries of romanticized storytelling, but their experiences demand recognition as reminders that civilization's greatest legends often rest on foundations of unimaginable cruelty. The next time you see a Viking movie or read about Norse exploration, remember the countless women whose names we'll never know, whose lives were consumed to fuel the very adventures we celebrate. Their stories matter because they reveal the true cost of the world these warriors built. If this video opened your eyes to the darker truths hidden beneath historical legends, let me know what other uncomfortable histories you'd like me to explore. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones we'd rather not hear.